Hello everybody, I'm Dr. Duke, and welcome to our final installment of our lecture series on the Gospel of John. It's been a great load of fun for me this past 3 weeks, and I think this fourth and final lecture will hopefully tie some things together. We make no claims to being able to be absolutely comprehensive about what this wonderful gospel means and all of its complexities and depth in 4 short hours. But I think we'll tie some loose ends together and hopefully all walk away with a more profound understanding of this really deep, deep gospel. And so glad to be with you again. And we'll pick up right where we left off. We were considering the Gospel of John, and we spent the first 2 episodes giving a little history, a little background, talking about the philosophical, theological implications of the introduction to John and the context in which it was written. And then we spent last week looking at the gospel itself, and we'll wind down doing the same thing today. And we pick it up with the raising of Lazarus. To me, this is outside of the incarnation and the resurrection. This is probably the single most important miracle in the whole Gospels. It's one thing if Jesus Christ is the Son of God. It's one thing that when God enters this material world in human form, that God gets up again from death. That, as wondrous as it is, it's the seat of our faith. Without it, nothing else could be predicated. No other hopes or promises about eternity in the afterlife and the forgiveness of sins. None of that could be predicated without Christ getting up from that grave. Having said that, it is one thing for Jesus, the Son of God, to rise and conquer death. It is quite another thing for us to do it. And the raising of Lazarus from the dead, in that regard, from a purely existential standpoint, if God exists, and we know he does, then it is existentially perfectly possible for him to conquer something like death. But for us to do it, we in our biological reality, we trapped in this material prison house of time and space and change, for us to get up again is powerful. And there are other places in the Gospels, other Gospels, where Jesus does bring people back from the dead, the little girl who died, or this, most famously when he says in Aramaic, Talitha kumi, right, little girl, get up. But you know none of the backstory. And we don't have a lot of the detail. With the story of Lazarus, we have tremendous, tremendous detail. So let's take a look at it. John chapter 11. Now a certain man was sick, named Lazarus, of Bethany, the town of Mary and her sister Martha. It was that Mary which anointed the Lord with ointment, and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. And so already you see that we have a family dynamic here. This is not some little girl who's being carried to her funeral who had just died. This is a family, brother and 2 sisters, who have intimate acquaintance with Jesus. Mary has washed his feet with her hair. It was this Mary. Therefore, Jesus' sisters, Lazarus' sisters sent unto him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom thou lovest is sick. And that's beautiful too, right? There are very few places in the Gospels, I can think of one other off the top of my head, and we'll see it later, where Jesus is said to have loved individuals, as if there was some more personal connection than just the general love of all humankind, those not yet born even. This is something different. There's a personal connection with him and this family, and with Lazarus. When Jesus heard that the one he loved was sick, he said, This sickness is not unto the death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God might be glorified thereby. That's really remarkable too, when you think about it, that Jesus understands that this sickness will end in death, that there will be no respite for Lazarus whom he loves or his sisters who he loves. And the purpose of this death is going to be that God will be glorified, that God will be glorified through this death, which is really a powerful image. But it also seems like, from a human perspective, a cruel one. You know, we think a little bit, and I've said this before, one of the main purposes of reading Scripture is to understand God's perspective on us. Far too often, I think, we read the Bible from the perspective of us. We see through the eyes of David or Solomon or Peter. We sort of look around in the Bible, Old and New Testament, to see what benefits, what warnings perhaps for us, certainly, but what benefits will accrue if we stay faithful to God. It becomes a very us-centered book. Many of us, to be very blunt, we open the Bible only when we need something, or we're seeking something, or we feel like we're missing something, or we want to ask the Lord for something. It becomes our book, which is really in many respects a violation of the first commandment, isn't it? We take the book where God has decided to reveal himself to us, and we make it about us. And it's tempting here to see through the eyes of Mary and Martha, to see through the eyes of the sick Lazarus. This is a God, this is a Christ, this is a man who has healed strangers, who has brought in people whose names he did not know back from death, who has made random blind men see and anonymous deaf men hear. But now you have a situation where somebody close to him personally needs him, and he won't go. He will let nature take its course to glorify the Father. And that seems to me to be a powerful lesson on mortality, and mortality in the context of God. All of the joys and triumphs, all of the successes we have, and even what we suffer and despair of, these things are less important in the grand scheme of things than the glorification of God. The purpose of us, the Bible makes abundantly clear, is to glorify him. And in the reflected glory of that glorification, he will provide for us. So looking at it from the perspective of Lazarus and Martha and Mary, this almost seems like a cold thing or a calculated thing. Atheists and materialists who criticize the Gospels might be tempted to see in this one more of those examples of how cruel your God is. This is the same God that let Satan into the Garden of Eden. This is the same God that didn't destroy slavery in the Old Testament. This is the same God. And you know the refrain. In fact, that's a really important point, I think. Those atheists, materialists, skeptics, and progressives who see in the Bible only God's cruelty or his absence or his refusal to grant equality to everybody in terms of looks or intellect or wealth, those people are the ones who approach the Gospels, the Bible in particular, to see images of themselves. They look at God through their own human experience. They're angry with God for not making them stronger. They're frustrated with God for not fulfilling their political agendas. They're absolutely rabidly angry at the Lord for not doing in the world what they would do if they were God, and that's it exactly, right? The atheist, the progressive, the skeptic, they come to the Bible because they're not satisfied with what God should have done, how God could have done it better for them, how God could have changed things, overridden free will to force on the universe, to force on mankind some kind of political goodness, absence of death, lack of suffering, and actual denial of free will. Isn't that always the way with the progressive? That God would have been a better God if he had taken freedom from us and forced us into a kind of uniform happiness that wasn't contingent upon our choice or our actions or our hearts. But we shouldn't fall into that trap too, and too many of us do. We come to the Bible with those same exceptions, not from a progressive position. Maybe we don't want the equivalent of global communism, where everybody is always the same, but we do come to the Bible for our own personal desires. And this story tells you something, I think, really moving and meaningful, that for Jesus Christ, who loved Lazarus and his sisters, that their suffering and death, like all of our suffering and death, like his suffering and death on the cross, went to glorify God first, to glorify the Father who sent him. And because Jesus was willing to glorify his Father with his own death on the cross, in the reflected bask and glow of that act of sacrifice for God, salvation came for every human being before and since. If we move to the next slide, when Jesus had heard, therefore, that Lazarus was sick, he abode 2 days still in the same place where he was. So he waits around. He doesn't go. All right? He's going to wait until Lazarus dies. Then, after that, saith he to his disciples, Let us go into Judea again. His disciples said unto him, Master, the Jews of late sought to stone thee, and goest thou thither again? And Jesus answered, Are there not 12 hours in the day? If any man walk in the day, he stumbleth not, because he seeth the light of this world. But if a man walk in the night, he stumbleth, because there is no light in him. These things said he. And after that he said unto them, Our friend Lazarus sleepeth, but I go that I may awake him out of sleep. And what I love about this particular passage is Jesus talks almost parabolically, right? He talks quite metaphorically. He decides they're going to go back to Judea. He decides, Jesus, that they're going to wander back now towards Lazarus. And the disciples are confused by this. Well, why are you going back there when the Jews sought to arrest you, sought to take you? Why are you putting yourself in danger that way? And Jesus gives that wonderfully poetic articulation. Are there not 12 hours of sunlight in the day? If a man walks in the day, he does not stumble. I am the light. I am that daylight. As long as I walk with you, there is no stumbling. Jesus seems to be implying your days of darkness are coming when you will no longer have me. And you see how beautifully this ties back to the creation story at the beginning of the Gospel of John. The Word that was there from the beginning, the Word that was God, the Word that was with God, that and the light that came into the darkness. Remember all the way back 4 weeks ago when the opening of the Gospel of John suggests that Jesus is the light, the creative light who entered the world, and the darkness knew him not. Those days are about to return. We're winding down Christ's ministry. And it really is a beautiful sentiment that you go all the way back to primitive history, all the way back to Noah and Adam, and all the way forward to the end of the world, however many centuries, decades, millennial that might be. And what you have here is the darkness of creation. It looks light to us because we're on the downside of it, right? We're on the downside looking up at the sun. But the sun is just a very, very, very weak night light compared to the light of God that stands above it beyond the heavens. So when we look up, we see to us this blazing beam, but it's a nightlight in this dark world. It's something we can hang our hats on for 12 hours a day. But you think about what's beyond our solar system, our universe, be that light beyond the created reality, this material world, it is genuine light all the time. And Jesus is a fragment. Jesus is a walking shard of that eternal light in this dark world, and the darkness knows him not. Are there not 12 hours in the day? If any man walk in the day, he does not stumble because he has me, the light of this world. But if a man walk in the night, he will stumble because there is no light in him. Without me and without the Creator God, all is darkness. These wonderfully parabolic and metaphorical things Jesus says. These things said he, and after that, because it was pretty clear that the disciples did not know how to interpret this, he looks them in the eyes and he says, "Our friend Lazarus is asleep, but I go that I may wake him." And that's it. Beautiful existential moment, right? This is right out of Shakespeare, got his to be or not to be speech in part, I think, from this, right? To be or not to be, that is the question. And is there light? Is death just a sleep, Shakespeare says? If dying was just going to sleep, it'd be easy. We all like to sleep. Nobody likes to get up. If death were just sleep, we would all choose it. That's the animal materialist argument, isn't it, that Jesus seems to be refuting here. Death is but sleep. If you have faith, then you realize that all death is but a going to sleep. It is not a permanent condition. It results, actually, when you wake up from the sleep of death, when you go join the Maker, it results in the best possible reality. And in this case, Jesus calls it sleep, right? To emphasize the impermanent nature of it. You contrast that to materialists, contrast that to the ethos of the modern world, which suggests we're all just animals. And when we go to sleep, we put animals to sleep, right? When we go to sleep too, that's the end of us. And the natural processes of decay are all that are left to our material existences, while all of our emotions, our love, our creativity, our imagination, those things are somehow snuffed forever. That's what we call existentialism. This yawning gulf between absolute eternity and absolute nothing. Shakespeare did, in his to be or not to be speech with Hamlet, really nail that existential argument. Is there something beyond death? As Hamlet says, the reason we all don't go to sleep, we don't kill ourselves when things go bad, we don't put ourselves into the joy of sleep, because sometimes you sleep, you have dreams. Sometimes those dreams are bad dreams. And who's to say that suicide won't lead to an endless torment of bad dreams? Because there may be something after death, Shakespeare says. And with Jesus here, it's a very powerful statement of that. He is the Lord of life and death. He is the light of the world. And for him, death is but a sleep. It's a very existential thing, right? And it all flows through Jesus. Being and then without him, nothingness, that darkness that will return. The disciples respond, Lord, if Lazarus sleep, he shall do well. Isn't sleep also what binds up sickness? If Lazarus has been physically sick, doesn't sleep fix that? Not only does sleep end suffering and end existence, it also cures biological sickness or psychological disorder, mental illness. Then said his disciples, Lord, if he be asleep, he shall be well. Howbeit Jesus spoke of his death, but they thought he had spoken only of taking rest in sleep. Then said Jesus unto them plainly. Again, do you see how Jesus has to keep translating into human what his lofty religious sentiments are? Right? It's a shame that the darkness doesn't understand the light. It's a shame that the darkness is utterly confused by the light that stands in front of it. And so Jesus has to take his really lofty statements about the philosophy and theology of heaven, of light, of salvation, of what comes after death, and become so prosaic with his apostles. He says to them, Lazarus is dead, guys, right? Lazarus is dead. And I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, to the intent you may believe. And believing, this is one of the few places in the Gospels where Jesus is going to insist beforehand with a miracle that he will, for his disciples and some chosen few, he will allow them to see the reality of belief. I will show you this, that you may believe. The implication here is that, and we see it in their conversation with Jesus, for all their love of Jesus, for all their commitment to him, the fact that they've given up everything to follow him, we also see that on some level they don't believe in him. On some level, they still don't believe in him. Which is why he has to translate his speech. Lazarus is dead, boys. And I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, to the intent that you may believe. The strong assertion is you still don't believe yet. Nevertheless, let us go unto him. And then said Thomas, and we're going to see Thomas at the end of the lecture today. He's going to be the last thing we talk about in this gospel. This is doubting Thomas, right? This is that same Thomas who, when he was absent from Jesus' first appearance to the disciples after he died and resurrected himself, after that, Thomas wasn't there. And so consequently, he says, I will not believe it until I see it. And so it's a wonderful foreshadowing of the doubting episode at the end of John's gospel here. We'll come right back to it. And I hope you can see, with all the ways this gospel folds back in upon itself, all of the tropes and images and signs and symbols keep getting picked up later in the gospel, how by the time you get to the end parts of the gospel, all of this beautiful cosmology and theology and history and philosophy, it begins to be woven together. The individual strands of all of these wonderful things that John is laying down are being woven in a very coherent, very poetic, very artistic way. But then said Thomas, which is called Didymus, unto his fellow disciples, let us also go that we may die with him. Isn't that great? Thomas doesn't understand any of this. He's a pretty rational man. He's pretty earthbound. He doesn't get what's going on with Lazarus. He just knows that Jesus is walking back into an area where they almost captured him. And so Thomas the zealot, like a zealot, right, says, well, let's just go die with him, right? The same Thomas who will deny him after death is going to, like Peter did in the other Gospels, is here going to go die for him quickly, that impetuosity. Let us go, Thomas says, that we may die with him. And then, when Jesus came, he found that he had lain in the grave 4 days already. Now, Jesus had found out that by the time he finally accomplished his journey into the vicinity of Bethany, he found out that Lazarus had been dead and buried for 4 days already in the caves. And remember, this is Judea. This is a hot place. Heat is not good for dead bodies. They had no refrigeration. So one of the reasons why they would bury bodies in a cave, theoretically, is that they would be a little cooler. But then when you rolled the stone up against a cave and you cut off the airflow, that's going to be a little bit like a pressure cooker. So the specifics, what I love about John's gospel here is the absolute existential specifics about death. They're not playing around here. 4 days, 4 days. All right, and what does that mean? What does 4 days dead mean? The other creatures, the other human beings that Jesus raised from the dead, the few others that he raised, like that little girl, they hadn't even been really dead very long yet. They had just passed. So, you could even make the skeptical argument that, well, maybe they weren't dead. Maybe the medicine in Jesus' day, the doctors weren't sophisticated enough to be able to recognize how shallow one could breathe, how slow the heartbeat could become before death really set. And maybe that little girl, if you want to be a skeptic, that Jesus rose from the bier, maybe she was really just in a coma or something. But John here, he's very, very engaged with, again, what I call this existential dilemma, the dilemma between life and death, and what that means, and how with God there is the possibility of life beyond the grave, and without him there isn't. And that existential teeter-totter back and forth. The gospel writer John reminds us that when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had lain in the grave 4 days already. Now Bethany was nigh unto Jerusalem, about 15 furlongs off. And many of the Jews came to Martha and Mary to comfort them concerning their brother. Then Martha, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him. This is a wonderful commentary on Rachel and Leah in the Old Testament, right? The active and the passive life, those two wives of Jacob, one that comes to symbolize the active faith in God, the other the passive faith in God, and they both have their place. But in the New Testament, you have Mary and Martha. And Martha gets up and bustles off. This is the same Mary and Martha that in a previous episode, Jesus is talking about them. And Jesus is teaching in the house of Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And Martha's fussing around. She's plumping the pillows. She's putting out iced tea, right? She's running errands. She's trying to make sure everything's picked up and clean for the master. And Mary is just sitting there. Mary is sitting there on her knees listening to Christ, raptured by his teaching. And Martha gets a little upset, right? And she says to Jesus at one point, Lord, make my sister help me. I'm doing all this housework, and she just sits there. And Jesus says to her, Martha, I will not tell Mary to do that. She has chosen the better way. It is good what you're doing, Martha, but she has chosen a better way. She has chosen to sit and listen to me. And so there's a wonderful dichotomy there between the busy and the not busy. And in Jesus' mind, in that case, the not busy Mary was much, much more seriously engaged than Martha was, despite all of her wonderful goodwill in trying to be sure that Jesus and his comrades were comfortable. Then when Jesus came, he found that he had lain in the grave 4 days already. Now Bethany was nigh unto Jerusalem, and many of the Jews came with Mary and Martha. Martha, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, went and met him on the road. But Mary, she sat still in the house. And you see that wonderful picking up of the previous story. There's Martha always bustling. And there's Mary never budging, right? And in this case, the same devotion that Martha showed trying to clean up for Jesus, she now shows here. She runs to meet him, right? She anticipates his coming. She gets up and leaves the house. Whereas Mary, rather stubbornly, she's heartbroken, right? The same Lord and Savior that she listened to on her knees the previous time now seems to have abandoned them, left them in the lurch, ignored the sickness of Lazarus. And so she stubbornly stays where she was. Well, Martha's the one that goes. Then said Martha unto Jesus, Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died. And that's a statement of faith, isn't it? Kind of, right? It's a past tense statement. I have faith in you, Lord, in what you would have done had you been here. That, in other words, for all her belief, Martha has temporalized Jesus, hasn't she? She has reduced the divine creator God to nothing more than a figure acting in time. He is not the God who created time. He is not, in this instance for Martha, the God who supersedes time. He is just another man bound by the same linear timeline and ultimately subjected to the grave and its impossibility of revocation in the same way that Lazarus is. You see in this story already how many different kinds of faith there are. The apostles that follow him, who have seen all the miracles, who Jesus says basically, you still don't believe yet. And it's pity that I'm going to have to raise somebody from the rot and decay of the grave to maybe get you to the point where you do believe. You've got Thomas, who seems to be completely unable to comprehend any of this. If it's time to die, it's time to die, Thomas says in his zeal. And now you've got Mary and Martha. And you've got Martha, who bustles off to Jesus because she knows he's the answer. And you've got the disappointed, broken-hearted Mary, who refuses to go see Jesus. Because why didn't he come when we needed him? And you see how just complicated and wonderful all of this lack of faith is in the presence of the Savior. Martha said, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, "Jesus, Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died. But I know," she says, "that even now, whatsoever thou wilt ask of God, God will give it to thee." And so there's the second half of it, right? In spite of the fact that he died because you weren't here, I know that whatever you ask of the Father will give it to thee. And I love how she phrases that, right? She doesn't ask him, "Bring back my brother." She doesn't say to him, "Give me back my brother," but that's what's filled her whole heart, right? She puts it on him, that onus on him. I know. It's clever. I know that whatever you ask of the Father will give you. That's kind of a very manipulative observation on her part, one born out of sympathy and desperation, but nonetheless manipulative. Jesus said unto her, "Thy brother," and she gives sort of a theological response. "I know who you are," she says. "You handle it. I know who your father is. You let him handle it." And so he responds to her the same way, with a rather inappropriately theological answer. He says to her, "Oh, what are you worried about, woman?" Right? Jesus said unto her, "Yeah, your brother will rise again. Thy brother shall rise again." Don't you know your theology? We Jews now believe in the resurrection of the body, the life again. Martha saith unto him, "I know that he shall rise again." Can't you just see the frustration here? Why are you giving me Sunday school lessons? Why are you giving me Sabbath lessons? When what I really need is you to work this miracle, help my despair. She says to him, I think I always like to picture this a little crossly. "I know that he shall rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Well, Jesus now says to her, right? Why didn't you personalize it? What about me, Jesus says, right? I am that resurrection. Do you not understand that yet, he says to her? I am the resurrection and the life. That through me, all that is dead can live again, and without me, it's not possible. I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. That's a remarkable statement about sin, and it's a reminder of Jesus that the real death is not what happens to the body. This is a profound observation on Christ's part. That what real death is not what happens to the body when the heart stops beating. Real death is the death in sin. Real death and stagnation and decay is the sinful state that prohibits us to join with God after death, after the biological process. It's a powerful example of Christ's theology in this gospel. I am the resurrection. Why? I mean, on a physical level, when my body is killed, my human body, and I resurrect, right, that forms a portal for you. It allows you access to the Lord. Death has been overcome. Remember what was told to Adam, right? What was prophesied in the Old Testament, that there was no way around death unless some mediator was offered, and Jesus is that mediator. And the second side of that, although I am the resurrection and the life, he says, and simply he who believes in me, this is the answer to the real death of sin. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. And then he says to her, do you believe this, Martha? Believest thou this? She said unto him, Yea, Lord, I believe that thou art the Christ, the Son of God, who should come into the world. And so she has it, right? All her spiritual sins are forgiven. Even this ambiguous response to him and the way she tries to deflect what she wants, what she's dying for herself from him. And that's the statement of faith. Yea, Lord, that's it. I believe that thou art the Christ, the Son of God, which should come into the world. And when she had said so, she went on her way. In other words, she played theology with him. He played it back. And then he explained the theology, and she walks away. Now, we don't know what she walks away. Does she walk away disappointed? Does she walk away refreshed? Does she walk away hopeful? The Gospels don't tell us. And when she had said so, she went on her way and called Mary, her sister, secretly, saying, The Master is come, and he calls for you. It's beautiful, right? And think about what Jesus is doing here. He knows where Mary was. He knows that the last time he was in this home, Mary sat at his feet swallowing up the instruction, gobbling down greedily all the words of wisdom from this wonderful figure, this master, this rabbi, this Christ. And so Jesus, he knows, right? He knows what Mary's doing. And so he tells Martha, you tell your sister, right? And the master is come, and he calls for thee. And as soon as Mary heard it, she quickly arose and came unto him. Now Jesus was not yet come into the town, but was in that place where Martha met him. The Jews then, which were with her in the house, and comforted her, when they saw Mary, that she rose up hastily and went out, they followed her, saying, she goeth unto the grave to weep there. And that's, in many ways, as sublime as Old Testament philosophy can be, and as wonderful as the Psalms and the chosen people, the covenant between God and men that we witness there, the Jews, like every other people on earth at this point in time, are still a condemned people, in the sense that there is no answer to death. The answer to death is standing before them in this Messiah. But so the Jews think when Mary gets up and runs, she's running to weep at the grave, right, to mourn over dead things. Well, no time to mourn for the dead when the life is there. No time to mourn for the darkness of the grave when the light of life is standing before you. And there's a bit of a parable here, I think, too. Then, when Mary was come to where Jesus was, and she saw him, she fell down at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died. Those are the same feet that she falls down in front of, that she had wiped with her tears, dried with her hair, as she anointed him for the coming death. In other words, when she anointed him, when she wept over his feet and used those tears to bathe those dusty Middle Eastern feet with all the sand and desert, and then she took her hair down and she dried those feet with her hair, and the scribes and the Pharisees who were in the room were mortified, absolutely mortified, that this so-called holy man would allow a woman to efface herself before him in this inappropriate way. And you remember the story, right? Jesus looked at the head Pharisee at the table and said, Simon, I have something to say to you. What's that, Rabbi? Simon said. From the moment I sat down here, this woman has never stopped wiping my feet or kissing them. But I entered your house as a guest, and you gave me no water for my feet, and you gave me no kiss for my face. Right? Therefore I say unto you, this woman will be forgiven much, because she has loved much. And that's a powerful lesson that the Pharisees had forgotten. The Pharisees had come to believe that they were righteous simply because they prayed the right way, ate the right way, sat in the right place in the temple. They had access to the one true scripture of the Old Testament. That's what they had access to. So simply by being in possession of those things, they considered themselves righteous and saved. And the message of Christ, the main animosity between him and the Pharisees, was Christ pointing out to them, without love in your heart, all those prescriptions and prohibitions and dietary laws, they don't mean anything. They're a dead thing, right? And you see again how life and death, light and dark, and every aspect of this wonderful story keeps coming back, being foreshadowed. So Mary falls again at those feet that she kissed and wept over and washed. And she said the same thing her sister said. When Jesus, therefore, saw her weeping, and the Jews also weeping, which came with her, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled. Now, we don't get much evidence of the emotional state of Christ as he goes about healing in most of the Gospels. He is a faithful healer. He's a devoted healer. He's direct in the way he heals, puts his hands on people. He touches them. He doesn't just wish it from afar. He interacts with the dirt and the grime and the pus and the blood of all the sick people he's tried to deal with. This is one of those rare moments where we see the real broken heart of Jesus in the face of death. Death that, by the way, is not his creation. He's the Lord God. The creation of death was the consequence of our own choice. It was the consequence that we, human beings, brought into the world, not something that God intended for us. And so he's watching in a very tangible way the grief, the sorrow, the tears, the misery that comes with death. And when Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews also weeping which came with her, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled, and he said, Where have you laid him? They said unto him, Lord, come and see. And that's beautiful, because how many times in the Gospels do you have a situation where the response from Jesus or the disciples is, come and see? Do you remember when Jesus called his first disciple, right? And you had this wonderful conversation about who Jesus was. And his response to the disciple was, who wasn't sure who this man was, but why he had such a hold on him. Jesus said to him, come and see, right? Jesus' way of saying, why don't you come and watch? Come and see what I am. Now that's been turned back around on him, hasn't it? The Jews said to him, come and see, right? Jesus wept, and you know, the shortest verse in all the Bible, and the most poignant. The Creator God in human form encountered death and sin, and at this point, it broke him a little bit, and the emotions come out. Jesus' grief for our grief, the grief of a God. As somebody once pointed out, the only God in the ancient world who died and had the kind of wounds to show that he suffered the way we suffer is this God, the God Christ. Then said the Jews, behold how much he loved him. And some of them said, could not this man, which opened the eyes of the blind, have caused that even this Lazarus should not have died? And so you even have now some Jewish figures who didn't see the other miracles, who weren't necessarily sure who this man was. But with this kind, it's not even the power of Jesus, it's the love and the sorrow of Jesus that moves even these people who don't know him that well to wonder, is it not possible that this man who reputedly opened the eyes of the blind might not have caused that even this man should not have died? The beautiful parable here. And again, I come back to the existential nature of all of this, that teetering between belief and disbelief. Everything depends. What does the grave mean? Is the grave an end or is it a beginning? Because every single thing depends on your attitude towards that. If the grave is an end, and modern culture has bought that lie, the grave is the end. It's the end of you. It's the end of what you were. It's the end of your legacy. It's the end of your heart, your emotions. If that's true, then it's a pretty grim reality. And life becomes a very hedonistic, jungle-driven thing. We're animals in an animal world, and the purpose is to hang on as long as possible, as long as comfort endures. But if that grave isn't a box that ends things, but it's a doorway into a greater place, that place of Christ, then the entire perspective on existence changes. Comfort becomes an enemy, not a good. Comfort, satisfaction, worldliness, these things become, the whole script flips. This is the world that's going away quickly. This is the world that's in the process of fading. This is the world that dies. This is the material reality that will not stay. Real permanence can only come in the next world. And that's the crux of the existential dilemma here. Jesus, therefore, groaning in himself, second time we've heard him groan, cometh to the grave. It was a cave, and a stone lay upon it. Jesus said, take away the stone. Right? That's exactly what's going to be happened. That's what's going to happen with his own crucifixion, right? They put him in the grave. 3 days later, they come and roll the stone away becomes the mantra, right? It becomes the mantra in the modern world. In the English language, it's become a trope. The roll the stone away moment is the let's prove it moment. All right, roll the stone away and let's see if his body is there. And here, as a foreshadowing of that, Jesus says to the attendants there, take ye away the stone. And Martha, right, despite her love, despite her faith, biology gets the better of her. How easy is it? How dangerous and how easy is it to assume that our biological, visceral realities limit God as much as they limit us? This is what we said at the beginning of this lecture today, right? The existential moment here, biology. How easy it is to become worldly. Martha, the sister of him that was dead, saith unto him, Lord, by this time he stinketh, for he hath been in the grave, he hath been dead for 4 days. That's a remarkable line by biblical standards. It is frank, it is blunt, it is creepy in its specificity, right? She's worried about this. This is the same Martha that spent the time Jesus was in her house cleaning it, right, to make sure he was comfortable. I suppose we shouldn't be overly surprised that she's a little fussy when it comes to messy, decayed things too. And she's the one who points out to the Savior, Jesus, it's almost as if, I didn't realize this is what you were going to do. I didn't realize you were going to bring him back by rolling the stone away and exposing the biological processes of corruption to all of us. And you almost wonder if she's kind of regretting her choice now, right, a little bit, given what Jesus is about to do. Lord, by this time he stinketh, for he hath been dead 4 days. That's the moment, isn't it? That's the moment when death can no longer be explained some other way. The rot, the decomposition, the smell demonstrates that death is in the process of doing its absolute worst. And at this point, there is no human, scientific, biological, philosophical way of counteracting that. That's the existential moment. Dostoevsky, the great Russian writer, said it's moments like that, the sight of the dead in the grave or the sight of Christ in the grave, that would make a man lose his faith. That existential moment when you don't know if Lazarus, let alone Jesus, will get up again. Lord, by this time he stinketh, for he hath been dead for 4 days. Jesus said unto her again, the same lesson, right? This time perhaps a little bit impatiently, said I not unto thee, that if thou wouldst believe, thou shouldst see the glory of God? Did I not say to you that your only tact, your only position, your only hope, your only option is to believe? Believe. When it becomes darkest, when death seems the most imminent, when suffering and grief seem to overweigh everything, that's when you have to believe the most. You cannot give up your belief when things get hard. That's when, existentially, the only belief that matters is the belief that comes out of suffering and despair. If everything is going well for you, if all your ducks are in a row and everyone's happy and comfortable and you've had a nice meal and a soft, easy chair, belief becomes implausible. It's easy to believe in those motions, but what does it mean when you are surrounded by all those good things? The real cutting place for grief and belief is in the pain itself. If you can believe when there seems to be no reason to believe, if you can believe when God seems to have withdrawn his hand from you and from the whole world, that kind of belief matters more. It really is the only clarifying place where absolute existential doubt and pain meets genuine faith. So without these horrifying moments of our lives, without pain and suffering and doubt, our faith could never be but a blunt knife. It's the suffering that sharpens it. And it's only the sharp suffering, the sharp faith, the faith in the face of those sharp sufferings that opens that door to heaven for us. And Christ's life is a testament to this. Said I not unto thee, that if thou wouldst believe, thou shouldst see the glory of God? Then they took away the stone from the place where the dead was laid. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and he said, Father, I thank thee that thou hast heard me, and I knew that thou hearest me always. But because of the people which stand by, I said it. In other words, this is unnecessary. That for Jesus to raise Lazarus from the dead, it doesn't require a speech. It requires his faith, his endurance, his belief in what God will do through him. And yet, he says it. He goes through the motions of the ritual prayer, of the ritual praying, as a way of convincing the people who still, Martha and Mary, despite as much as they call on him, as much as they run away from him, as much as they beg him to do something, they don't ask him what it is. They never once ask him what it is that they want done. This ritual of prayer is an important one. Father, I thank thee that thou hast heard me, and I know that thou hearest me always. But because of these people, including Mary and Martha, who I love, and my own disciples, I said it, that they may believe that you have sent me. And when he had thus spoken, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. And he that was dead came forth, bound hand and foot with grave clothes. That's a wonderful image. They wrapped him in linen, they bound him, they washed the body carefully. And when the still confused Lazarus is reanimated, he walks out. He comes out bound still by his grave clothes. Aren't we all? Aren't we all, from the moment we're born into this world, bound with grave clothes? Those swaddling clothes they put on us, those little onesies they stick on us when we're first born, the little caps they put on our heads, they're grave clothes. The minute you're born into this world is the minute you are guaranteed death. It is the moment, when the first moment you scent the air, is the very first moment that death becomes your legacy, your final human act. And so those clothes that we put on little babies and the grave clothes that we wrap corpses in, they're the same thing. It's the sin that binds us. It's the death that is our legacy as sinful human beings. And only one creature can undo those bonds. And you're standing before him. And he that was dead came forth, bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was bound with a napkin. And Jesus said unto them, only Jesus can say this. Only Jesus has this authority. Loose him and let him go. That's it. You come in to this world, your only real lasting legacy is death. We dress you in clothes till the moment you die, we bind your corpse, and that only letting go comes from the command of Christ. Then, and at that moment, not surprisingly, the existential moment has come and gone, right? That moment of existential teetering between absolute belief and absolute skepticism, between absolute life and absolute death, biologically smelly death. That existential moment has been resolved, maybe for the only time in the last 2,000 years, and probably all the thousands of years before it. We have an absolute answer to the existential problem, because the creator of the universe is standing there, showing you what are the consequences, who is bigger than death, who wins in this showdown. It is a sublime miracle. And even then, many of the Jews which came to Mary and had seen the things which Jesus did, they now believed on him. And as important as this is, always remember, and we're going to see it before we're done today, that it's better to believe without seeing. Once you've seen it and believed it, okay, I mean, I suppose you deserve credit for not being an idiot, right? To see this miracle and then to believe, well, I'm not sure how much credit you deserve, but clearly the apostles, who have seen many miracles, are still struggling. Clearly Mary and Martha, who have seen many miracles, aren't quite sure they believe as much as they should believe. So to believe here when you've seen, okay, if you're smart, it becomes a basic act. I'm not sure how much credit we deserve for it, but what about the rest? What about all those subsequent generations that are asked to believe without seeing it? Now that's that sharp knife that whets faith, isn't it? It's the whetstone of our faith. Move forward a little bit. Dying to live, right? John, in the very next chapter, Jesus makes a statement that I think helps explain a little bit of what I'm trying to say to you. In John chapter 12, Jesus answered the disciples, saying, "The hour is come that the Son of Man should be glorified. Verily, verily, I say unto you, except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abides alone. But if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit." That's beautiful, right? In fact, the great existential novel, The Brothers Karamazov, I think probably the greatest novel we have that explores the existential depths of faith and despair. In that novel, Dostoevsky, the one epigram that he has at the beginning of the book before it starts is exactly that. Unless a corn of wheat fall to the ground and die, it abideth alone. That's quite beautiful. That the implication is that think about wheat. Think about what are seeds? What are seeds? They're dead parts of pre-existing plants, things that drop off and seemingly die. They're buried underneath the earth, and yet from the death of that seed as it falls from the tree springs new life. That's us. That is our life. In order to live, we have to die. In order to blossom, we have to rot. In order to become what God intended us to do, we must fall to pieces in this material realm. And the entire Lazarus story is a wonderful, a lengthy digression on this very theme. And maybe if we were all a little more faithful and a little less literal, we wouldn't have even needed the story of Lazarus. Let me ask you this. How much better off would we be in the eyes of God if we all came to believe, or if all the apostles came to believe devoutly in the divine nature of Christ without having had to see Lazarus? As wonderful as it was to see Lazarus, how much more blessed would we have been to simply take what Christ tells us on faith and believe it so? That's the hard thing. And then he says, "He that loves his life shall lose it, and he that hateth his life in this world shall keep it." That's also powerful. The best way to live forever is to be willing to lose your life in this world. And that doesn't just mean physical death, which will come to all of us. It means dying to the world, right? Isn't that what Christ wants? Die to this world. Its lusts, its greeds, its envies, its anxieties, its greed, its selfishness. Die to that, Christ says, for just a short time. You're too young to appreciate you're too young to wallow in those sins until what, 9, 10, 12, 15 years? And usually the last 5, 10 years of your life, you're too old to enjoy those sins anyway. What are we talking here?
existentially. A couple of decades, 30, 40 years of your prime, where you can wallow in the excesses of materialism. It's a small price to pay to give that up for eternal life beyond the grave. And it's shocking how simple Christ made it for us. 7 statements from Jesus Christ on the cross. I'd like to end here because it's really remarkable. You take all 4 Gospels and you look at the things that Jesus actually said while he was hanging on the cross, and they amount to 7 simple statements. From the Gospel of Luke, we get 3 of them. Forgive them, Father. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. It's wonderful. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. On the cross, Christ is concerned not for his suffering, but for yours. He is concerned not for the crushing physical torment and suffering and pain that the road to Golgotha has inflicted on him, the whippings, the beatings, the spitting, the crowning with thorns, the buffeting, the nailing to the cross. That's not what concerns him. What concerns him is the pain, the real suffering that awaits those who did this. And he forgives them. Other-centered on the cross. Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. Verily, verily, I say unto thee, he says to the thief hanging next to him, thou shalt be with me in paradise. This day thou shalt be with me in paradise. The only innocent creature to ever walk this earth, hangs between 2 common thieves, and one of them asks forgiveness. And Jesus says, can you imagine? From a purely existential point, how wonderful would it be to be a thief, crucified, but alongside this Jesus? Existentially, are we better off living our quiet lives? Or would we actually have been better off to be thieves, crucified next to Christ? Because that conduit is what permits Christ's grace. And think about that. Today, to this day, Jesus says, you will be with me in paradise. What kind of... we're all thieves in a way. Sin is just stealing from God, whatever the sin is. It's just stealing something from God, whether it's time or love or jealousy or whatever. For our theft, right, we limp through to the end of our lives. But can you imagine how existentially shocking the life of this thief is? That the life that ends terminated on the cross alongside Christ immediately, without ever having the slightest idea how, it leads to the immediate salvation and blessedness of this sinner, this thief, who actually enters paradise when Jesus does. That's pretty remarkable when you think about it. And then also from the Gospel of Luke, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. Notice how all 3 statements in the Gospel of Luke are other-centered. Forgive them, Father, they know not what they do. He tells this repentant thief that you have found salvation in me. And finally, Father, I have done it, right? I give myself back to you, Father. It's wonderful. You jump ahead to the 4th of the statements of Christ from the cross, from the Gospel of Matthew and Mark. Those 2 Gospels, very different. My God, why have you forsaken me? Where are you? And so what I love about this is in Matthew, Mark, and in Luke's Gospel, you get what? You get the one side of the existential divide. I am the Son of God on the cross. I have the power to forgive this thief and take him to heaven with me. I have the power to forgive all of you who crucified me so unjustly. I have the power to will myself back into the hands of God beyond this material existence. There's the one side of the existential divide. And then in the Gospel of Matthew and Mark, you got the other one, right? My God, where are you? As he hung on that cross. His love for others was paramount in those first 3 quotes. In this quote, however, you see the other side. This is the human side pulling him down, right? As he suffers on that cross unjustly. Where are you? Father, where are you? Somebody once said that the only time in human history that God had to turn his back to his creation was when his own son died. The only time that God had to put his fingers in his ears and not listen sympathetically to the suffering of human beings was when his own son suffered. And so talk about the existential moment of darkest night, when God himself, for the purpose of this 3 hours on the cross, had to be deaf to his own son. That you don't get a deeper existential... That Lazarus story was nothing compared to this, right?
the depths of despair and doubt, that he had to do this alone. He had to choose to do it alone. Very powerful. And then we move to the final three statements on the cross from Christ from John. And these are quite beautiful. When Jesus, therefore, saw his mother from the cross and the disciple standing by whom he loved, right? So Jesus' mother is standing by the, quote, disciple Jesus loved. That's John, right? That, in theory, is the author of this gospel. When Jesus, therefore, saw his mother and the disciple standing by whom he loved, Jesus said unto his mother, Woman, behold thy son. Or eke, the Greek word, the word eke is behold in the Latin language, right? Many of those beautiful medieval paintings of the eke homo variety, behold the man revealed. And here's wonderful, right? This goes back to the nativity that didn't appear in the Gospel of John. This goes back to the nativity stories of Luke. Woman, behold thy son. In a way, it's almost like a rewriting of the angel Gabriel speaking to Mary. Woman, behold thy son. Then saith he to the disciple, Behold thy mother. And from that hour, that disciple took her into his own home. And we now know that from that moment, Jesus hands his mother over to the disciple he loves, the disciple who, in theory, if not perhaps in practice, wrote this gospel. The committing of Mary to John is a wonderful passing of the torch, right? That he must leave her. He must go back to where he came. And this union, this material union between mother and son is broken forever until she can join him again. But while he's on earth, she remains on earth, John has this custody of her. It's a wonderful way. And I remember I said to you, we would see a second time before we were done, where we learn that Jesus loves somebody specifically, and it's this disciple. And then you move from that to, after this, Jesus, knowing that all things were now accomplished, that the scripture might be fulfilled, said, I thirst. Now, I love this line, right? Jesus is up on the cross. He's bleeding out to his last drops of blood and bloody water, as we know from the other Gospels. But notice this. After Jesus recognizes that everything has been fulfilled, everything, only then does Jesus say, I thirst. And I think this is a wonderful way of going back to the woman at the well, who we looked at. The woman at the well who, when Jesus asked her for a drink, he was thirsty. Remember when last time Jesus was thirsty, sitting on that well in the desert? And he asked the woman, give me a drink. And she said to him, you Jews don't speak to us, right? Why are you talking to me? And he says to her, if you had known, and this is true for all of us, if you had known who it was that asked you for a drink, you would have given him one. And I would have then given you life, right? A thirsty draft leading to everlasting life. And here Jesus is on the cross. He knows everything is done at this point. He's accomplished it. And this thirsting here can no longer be a physical thirst, right? Like the woman at the well. This is that thirst leading up into a well, a spring of everlasting life. Where does he go from here existentially? And finally, when Jesus, therefore, had received the vinegar, he said, consummatum est. It is finished, right? This is John's Christ. This is the Christ who knows he is the Son of God, occupying for a few decades the dirt and clay of human flesh, of mortal existence. And now he's done it. He's done with the clay now, right? He can set it aside the same way we will set ours aside in death. And the commanding, it is finished. I have done it, right? Very different than the other Gospels. Quite beautiful, very existential, right? It has been the fiat complete, right? It's a fait accompli now. It's done. So it's quite beautiful. And he gives himself up to the Father. And we end, as I mentioned to you, our little 4-week episode on John. We end without doubting Thomas, because Thomas has been with Jesus from the beginning. Thomas has seen the miracles. He was there with Jesus when Lazarus was raised from the dead. Interesting. Thomas thought in his foolishness that Jesus was going to go die and that he would die with him. Well, nothing of the sort happened. They both went, and out of that fear was raised a man who had been dead for 4 days. And now Jesus has appeared once already to the disciples as they hide and cower in the room they have rented with their Savior gone. Jesus appeared to them, showed himself to them, but Thomas wasn't there.
And now Thomas, if we look at the passage, but Thomas, one of the 12, called Didymus, was not with them when Jesus came. The other disciples therefore said unto him, We have seen the Lord. But he said, Except unless I shall see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and thrust my hand into his side, I will not believe. I mean, this is absolute recalcitrance, isn't it? After everything he's seen, after everything that's been done here, Thomas says, you can't get this is the existential equivalent of, Lord, by now he stinketh, isn't it? What's he asking for here? What is he asking of Christ? That unless I can enter your body with my own, and unless I can put my fingers inside of your almighty body, I don't believe in you. I mean, you cannot get more existentially lost than this from one who should know better. And what happened? And after 8 days again, his disciples were within, and Thomas with them. Then came Jesus, the doors being shut, and stood in the midst and said, Peace be unto you. Then saith he to Thomas, Reach hither thy finger, and behold my hands, and reach hither thy hand, and thrust it into my side, and be not faithless, but believing. Love it. And do not be faithless. If that's what it takes, Thomas, if my testimony and my prophesying and my death, my miracles weren't enough to you, then by all means take yourself further. Put yourself in me. Go ahead. But I love the condemnation and the blessing at the same time. And be not faithless, but believing. And that is the perfect call for us, isn't it? Because there will be times in our lives when things don't go well. And the question is, do we believe then? Can we believe as we wander through this world of ours, through good times and bad times, doubt and faith? Can you do that? Can you not be faithless, but rather be believing? And as much as Thomas the Apostle, in the same way that maybe it would have been better off if we were, because we're all thieves, right, in a sinful way. Maybe it would have been better off if we were the thief who was crucified alongside Jesus to be able to enter the kingdom with him. Maybe existentially that downtrodden wretch executed by the Romans, maybe he was much more fortunate than we are. On the same token, for all of the love and miracles and closeness to the living, breathing Christ that Thomas experienced, maybe we're better off than Thomas because we haven't seen it, and by the grace of God, we believe it. Thank you very much for these 4 weeks. Visit us at freedomproject.com for a new lecture series. We've got another one coming down the road soon, and it's been a joy to be with you.